we're going to be talking now about a lot of those things and how they interconnect and what it all means. But that is going to be a kind of a weird ride. We're going to be painting on a broad canvas. We're going to be jumping around quite a bit in space and time. So bear with me. All this stuff fits together by the time I'm finished talking about it, and it will start to make sense to you, more sense to you as we go along. All right. Well, we're going to start in Japan. I know that this class is U.S. environmental history, but we're going to go back 2,500 years to Japan to look at this next topic, because it demonstrates some of the things that I'm going to be talking about, and even some of the things I've already talked about. In fact, it compares to the situation that occurred in New England with the arrival of the English. All right, so Japan is a series of islands in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of mainland Asia. It's made up of several islands. The biggest ones being from south to north, the island of Kyushu, the island of Shikoku, and then the largest island, the island of Honshu. And to the north of Honshu, the northernmost large island, the island of Hokkaido. And as you can see right here, there's a bunch of smaller little islands along the coast. And this only shows the biggest of those smaller islands. There's really a whole lot of them. Okay, so Japan, let me start off by saying, is not an environment that lends itself to agriculture because those islands are extremely mountainous. In fact, only about 20% of the land area of the Japanese islands can be farmed at all. Just 1/5 of that country's surface can be considered suitable for farming. So guess what? There wasn't a whole lot of farming going on in Japan, and by not a whole lot, I mean not any, for thousands of years. Although there were humans living on the Japanese islands for thousands, many thousands of years. However, they were not the people that we today think of as the Japanese. There was someone there before them, and they were there before them for a very long time. Those people are known as the Jomon, and it is believed, it is estimated that they were in the Japanese islands by about 16,000 years ago, 14,000 BCE. So roughly the same time that people were starting to wander farther afield as the last ice age was coming to an end. So these folks were living in the Japanese islands. They, like I said, they're not the modern Japanese. In fact, well, I'll get to that a little bit later. Let's talk about their name. They get their name from the type of pottery that they made. So we don't know what they called themselves because they had no written language, and therefore there is no record. The pottery they left behind, though, is called Jomon pottery in Japanese, and it denotes rope-like. And as you can see in this image, this clay pot, it's got these lines around the edge, very distinctive for that culture. And this particular pot is estimated to have been made somewhere between 8 and 10,000 BC. So that's an old pot. In fact, the Jomon people, so far as we're able to tell, were among the first humans to figure out that you can make pots out of clay. They didn't have fire-hardened clay. But they did have these clay pots, and that gave them the ability to store things. And if you'll recall, kind of touched on this just a minute ago, that ability to store things that comes along with pottery is like a big step toward, what people have referred to as, quote, civilization. However, in this case, it did not. The Jomon, and we'll look back at this picture again from before. By the way, this image is from a photograph of a museum exhibit in Japan. The Jomon people were hunter-gatherers and fishermen. They lived a subsistence existence. They were not as purely subsistence, I guess, as you could say that those nomadic bands that we talked about earlier were. They had built on that a little bit. They did have villages, but the villages didn't necessarily have permanent structures that were meant to last. It's entirely possible that, like with those Native American tribes we talked about, the villages would be moved every few years. So they got by on what they could catch, so far as hunting and fishing, and what they could gather, roots and wild berries and so forth. And they did have one domesticated animal. They had dogs, and here you can see some meat being cured by a Jomon woman. That was a long time, 14,000 BC to the 5th century CE. But the big changes we're going to be talking about came about 1,000 years before that, so less than 1,000 years, about 3rd, 4th century BC. Nonetheless, we're talking about a good 10,000 years at least, that these folks were the sole human occupants of the Japanese islands. Now, they had villages. Like I said, there are some other things that anthropologists have been able to extrapolate about their lifestyle by looking at the things left behind, the material culture, the pottery, that's a big thing, and other stuff, and those village sites. So here are some of the things we know about the Jomon. They had a very communal lifestyle. There was apparently no social stratification, and we can tell that by burial practices and by the layout of the villages. In villages, in cultures where there is social division, some people live in the better areas and are concentrated maybe on hills overlooking the peons, if you will. And the grave sites for those people who were upper class are in nicer areas, and they have more cool stuff buried with them. None of that is evidenced in Jomon culture. Apparently, it was a pretty equal culture. So, that would seem to be points in their favor. Another thing we know about the Jomon is that these villages that they built did not have walls around the city, which a lot of early towns and villages in other parts of the world did. They didn't have those. The reason for putting up walls is to prevent yourself from being invaded and attacked. And among the various Jomon communities within the Japanese islands, there's not any evidence of any large-scale organized warfare, which is not to say there was no evidence of violence at all. There was interpersonal violence, such as you get whenever there are human beings living in close quarters and getting in arguments about one thing or another, but there's no evidence of warfare. So, a very egalitarian society and a very peaceful society, which on the surface, almost sounds paradisaic. Sounds like the kind of thing that people aim for. But there's another side to the story as well. So over all those thousands of years, they had this pottery, which they developed not long after they got to the islands, and then really didn't develop much else. Why is that? Well, it's because resources are scarce, particularly if you don't practice agriculture. And essentially, the Jomon people spent all their time trying to stay alive. So it was a daily pursuit. You get up, and you try to make sure that there's water available enough for everybody in your village, and then you set about looking for food and hope you find some. That doesn't leave over a lot of spare time. That doesn't leave a lot of time to experiment and tinker around and come up with better ways to do things, because you just don't have that luxury. And that is common in cultures around the world that are groups of humans who live in resource-scarce areas, like, for example, the Arctic tundra I mentioned before, the Great Plains I also earlier mentioned. So on the one hand, very egalitarian, there's no war, but then again, the reason there's no war is there's nothing to fight about, because, why would one town invade another town? Why, it would be to take away what they've got, except they don't have anything, and neither do you, and everybody knows it. So instead of fighting one another, everybody's busy just trying to find something, right? So that keeps them from inventing new ways to kill each other, or reasons or excuses to do so. But it also prevents them from, making any other kinds of advances. Also the Jomon may have seemed, from what I initially described, to have had an idyllic lifestyle, and perhaps they regarded it as such, but it wasn't an easy one. Their average lifespans were pretty short, because they had a lot of lean times. If you're not getting enough to eat, then that also makes you more susceptible to various other kinds of things. So very communitarian, sort of like the thing I mentioned earlier about Sitting Bull when he was in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and was amazed at the fact that in these big cities there were poor people who had nothing, even children. And, in his culture, everybody shared, which meant either everybody was doing well or everyone was doing badly. Well, that's how it probably was among the Jomon, except everyone wasn't doing well very often. Mostly, everyone was doing poorly, but they were getting by, as evidenced by the fact they were still there after a good 15,000 years. And then something changed. The big change was the arrival of new people that today are referred to as the Yayoi. That was not their name for themselves. That name comes from actually a neighborhood near Tokyo, where some of the earliest archaeological finds of these folks were discovered. And so kind of similarly to how Clovis and Folsom points for spears in North America are named for the modern day towns near which they were found. So the Yayoi, firmly established at the latest by about 300 BCE, about 300, 4th century. There is more recent archaeological evidence that the process I'm about to describe may well have started a few centuries even before that, but certainly by 300 BCE. The Yayoi were in the islands, and these folks arrived by sea. Most likely scenario that they were fishermen initially from the Korean peninsula, who traveled far enough afield from the mainland that they came upon the island of Kyushu. That's where the earliest Yayoi, or the oldest Yayoi sites are, so far as they can tell at this point. So probably across the Sea of Japan from the Korean Peninsula, although there is also indication of a lot of cultural similarities between the early Yayoi people in northern Kyushu and the people from the culture from Jiangsu province in China. So could have been people coming from that direction. Probably it was both. Initially establishing trade with the local Jomon people, but within a short period of time beginning to settle on the islands, which is going to lead them into conflict with the native people because they're already there, right? So the Jomon we have described as being hunter-gatherers, not at the level of nomadic bands that traveled without a home. They did have villages, and they had clay pottery, but they had a very subsistence lifestyle. How do the Yayoi compare to that? Well, they're coming from the Asian mainland. They're coming from Korea and or China. What was going on in Korea and or China around that time? Well, we're talking about a couple of hundred years after the times of Confucius and Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War, in the middle of what's known as the Warring States period in China, where a bunch of smaller kingdoms were fighting against one another, trying to gain supremacy. So I bet that all of you have heard of Confucius, and probably all of you have heard of Sun Tzu, which is an indication, if you're familiar with them at all, that the China in which they lived was an extraordinarily advanced place for that time, maybe the most advanced place in the world at that time, and it was just almost a stone's throw from these rocky islands where these people were living a very basic hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So there's going to be a lot of advantages held by the Yayoi people. What kind of advantages did they have? Well, they had really big technological advances, things that had been developed in Asia that they obviously brought with them, including the knowledge of rice and how to cultivate it, how to grow it, how to harvest it, how to grow a large amount of it. Also, metal tools and weapons, bronze primarily, which is what was being used in China at the time. And they also had pottery, but they had the more advanced fire-hardened pottery. So they're coming over here. They have metal tools for farming. They have agricultural knowledge. And even though there's not a lot of farmable land in Japan, there is some. And so they were able to establish their towns there, their settlements, and set up their agricultural lifestyle, start growing rice, primarily rice and other things, millet. And then they had metal weapons to defend their stuff. So the towns that were established by the Yayoi, very different from the Jomon villages. The Yayoi towns had buildings that were obviously storage buildings, so that were lifted up off the ground, granaries, where they could put all the excess, all the extra grain, especially rice, that they grew. So they have the advanced agricultural knowledge. Well, any agricultural knowledge was advanced to the Jomon, who had none. So they're able to produce more than they need, which they're then able to store. And they have walls around their cities because they've got something to protect, and that is what they've acquired. That is their excess. Who do they need to protect it from? Maybe from the Jomon, maybe from other Yayoi towns and settlements. So they've got these walls. They've got a culture that definitely does show a distinct social stratification, very much a class system, which is what happens when you have a culture that is not communal, a culture in which there's the ability to have not only the stuff that you need to survive, but extra stuff. Whenever there's extra stuff, there's always somebody who has the extra stuff, and that gives them leverage, and that gives them privilege. So they wind up being the elites. And I know it may sound weird to be talking about rice as though it were wealth, but rice was wealth. I mean, even 1,500 years or more later, even in the feudal period, early modern Japan, up into the 1700s, people were paid not just in gold and so forth, but actually in amounts of rice. So, wealth was being accumulated. Wealth was being stored. Wealth was being protected. And these settlements were spreading. They were spreading out, getting more territory to farm, to create more agricultural goods, but essentially to create more wealth. Now, you've got the Yayoi people who are coming over with these advanced techniques of farming and with metal tools and with metal weapons. And, they have the advantage that they can carry along with them a copy of the book The Art of War by Sun Tzu, if they have access to it, which certainly some of them probably did. Compared to the Jomon, a very basic hunter-gatherer society who had no organized warfare, no organized politics. In a scenario like that, who do you think won? Well, I bet you can figure it out. The Yayoi eventually spread out all over the southernmost island of Kyushu, and then on to Shikoku, and then on to the larger island of Honshu, and continued spreading northward and eastward in Honshu, driving the Jomon people before them. So what happened to the Jomon people? In some cases, there was intermarriage. Certainly, there is DNA mixture between the Yayoi people and the Jomon people, and modern-day Japanese, which is referred to as the Yamato people. Modern-day Japanese have a large amount of Yayoi genetic code because essentially they're the descendants of the Yayoi. And some admixture in most cases with Jomon in there somewhere a long time back. So they were absorbed, maybe willingly, maybe by force, but they were absorbed into the larger group. And those who were not absorbed or killed were displaced and pushed to the margins. So there is no Jomon people now, but there are some non-Yamato people, some indigenous people in the Japanese islands who most likely are the descendants of the Jomon. And we're talking about the very southern part of Japan, the Ryukyu Islands, south of Japan, the Ryukyuan people, including the Okinawan people, who are, like I say, they're not phenotypical Japanese. They're not Yamato Japanese, and in Japanese culture, traditionally they were looked down upon. And then to the north, on the island of Hokkaido, there's a group of people called the Ainu. Now, the Ainu are similar to the Japanese in many ways, but in a lot of ways they seem to be more similar to Siberian tribes or Native American Indian tribes. So, spoiler alert, they're a tribal people, an indigenous people. They practice the traditional type of religious pursuit and spirituality, shamanism, that those other groups I mentioned, Siberian and North American, Native American Indian do. They are physically different from the Japanese in one way, in that they are a lot hairier than Japanese people. They are like European level hairy. So these guys can have great big beards and big shaggy heads of hair, which is not typical in Japan. So the Ainu, by the way, in the early modern period, were essentially treated very similarly to how American Indians were treated by the colonial and later U.S. governments. The Japanese government, whether you're talking about the empire or the shogunate, which was the same but different, which is a long story. They were confined to Hokkaido. They were eventually, there were these programs where they were. The attempt was made to force them to give up their indigenous identities and cultural identities and become Japanese, to get sort of the same way, the same thing that was done to American Indians. They're still around. They still have their culture. There were other groups as well. I mentioned that the Yayoi spread along kind of a northeastern trajectory of the island of Honshu. Some of the people that they encountered there that held out for a long time were called the Emishi, probably also descendants of the Jomon. They're in the northern part of Honshu. And if you're familiar with the term shogun, which is essentially military dictator that was established in around the 12th century, that is short for a much longer term that translates roughly into general in charge of fighting the Eastern barbarians. So the Emishi eventually were subjugated and mostly absorbed. And then you got the Ainu, those Eastern barbarians. Now, by the way, be thinking about this. Hopefully you're already picking up on some of the similarities between what happened in Japan and what happened with indigenous people in North America. All right, well, I mentioned before that technology was going to increase whenever there was established agriculture. And here's what that's all about. Once you've got extra stuff, for one thing, you need to protect that extra stuff. Remember those walls around the city. But the elite classes of people who accumulated wealth, they needed someone to work for them and work with them to help them to protect that wealth. And that led, both in Japan and in Europe and in other parts of the world, that led to a feudal system, led to this group of people developing that were not quite the nobility, but also were well above the commoners, referred to as in Europe as knights, in Japan as samurai. So necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. So these types of kind of militaristic subcultures would develop in these civilizations. And if you think about it, in comparison to the Jomon, who had to spend almost all their time thinking about whether or not they're going to find something to eat today, you've got the Yayoi people who are spreading out pretty quickly, and they have all these advantages, and they have a class system. So if you are of the upper class and you're the one who owns a lot of that extra stuff that you now have engaged other people to protect for you, you've got leisure time. You've got spare time. And in that spare time, you can think about things. You can experiment with things. You can become creative. You can become inventive in a way that it's hard to do when your whole day is spent just making sure you don't starve to death. So people were able to have that spare time, that class of people who could become artists, artisans, craftsmen, inventors, right? Thinking of the more stuff you've got extra, the more clout that gives you, the more time you have to think up even better ways to get more stuff and protect more stuff. And that's sort of this impetus that leads to what I hinted at earlier, a fairly rapid amount of change. Now, the population of the Yayoi, we know because of the archaeological sites, just grew like crazy. And it is speculated that was not solely because of the immigration rate of people coming from Korea and China. But it was also due to the fact that the Yayoi had these settlements and had this agriculture that was able to support a larger population. So just their natural population growth was much faster than the Jomon, who had that short lifespan because so many of them died in childhood because life was so rough. Well, these people, because of all their advantages, they also can keep making more people more quickly. So that's a whole series of things that gives them a big set of advantages. All right. Well, the reason I spent so much time talking about the Jomon and the Yayoi was because it's a really good illustration. It's one of the best illustrations I can think of to show the difference in sort of the trajectory of subsistence cultures as opposed to acquisitive cultures. And also, even if you've never heard of either of those groups of people before, it probably still seemed like a familiar story to you. You probably still recognize the comparison with what happened with those agriculture subsistence groups in New England and in the southern colonies when they encountered the Europeans. So it's the same story with the same outcome. And that outcome would be repeated over and over again in other cultures. Now, it almost seems like what we've just described is an early battle between capitalism and socialism or communism, but it's not, because none of those things existed yet. And none of what we described as having existed really fits in with the full definition of those terms. But there are some similarities. The fact is that once capitalism gets introduced, it's going to ratchet things up even higher. So next we're going to look at how that happened and what that meant ultimately for resources and for global environment. So take a deep breath. We'll jump into that.